Hi Angels. This is Rising from the Depths by the Angel Demon on AO3. Summary. Izuku Midoriya is overwhelmed by the pressure of being the successor to One for All, feeling like he's drowning under the weight of his responsibilities. As a new villain threatens the safety of his friends, Izuku learns that true strength comes from trusting others. With the help of his classmates, he begins to let go of his fears and share the burden, realizing he doesn't have to face the challenges alone. Rising from the Depths follows Izuku's journey of growth, vulnerability, and finding hope in the support of those around him. The air in Izuku's dorm room was still. Outside, the night had settled over UA, the quiet only broken by the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Izuku stood by the window, staring out at the dark sky, his reflection barely visible in the glass. His eyes looked tired, hollow, and there was a tension in his shoulders that had been there for weeks now, a tightness that wouldn't let go. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass, his breath fogging up a small circle in front of him. The familiar pressure was back again, a crushing weight that sat heavy on his chest, pressing down until it felt like he couldn't breathe. How much longer can I keep doing this? The thought slipped in before he could push it away, uninvited and unwelcome. It wasn't the first time it had crossed his mind. Lately, that question had been repeating itself, louder with each passing day. Every battle, every training session, every glance from his classmates, it all added to the ever-growing pile of responsibilities that felt like they were burying him alive. Izuku had always been strong. He had to be. There was no room for weakness when you carried One for All. There was no time to let your guard down when the world expected so much from you. But lately, it felt like the world was demanding more than he had to give. He closed his eyes, trying to shake the thought away, but the image came unbidden to his mind, himself, sinking. The deeper he went, the harder it became to breathe, and no matter how hard he struggled, the weight kept pulling him under. Drowning. It was the only way to describe it. He was drowning, and no one seemed to notice. His friends, his classmates, they all looked at him with admiration, with trust, with hope. They believed in him. They needed him to be strong. But every time they turned to him, it only reminded him of how fragile that strength really was. Izuku stepped away from the window, running a hand through his messy green hair. His reflection stared back at him, a mixture of exhaustion and something darker lurking behind his eyes. It felt like every time he looked at himself lately, there was a stranger staring back. He was supposed to be the next symbol of peace. He was supposed to be strong, unshakable, the one who could handle anything. But what would they all think if they knew how close he was to crumbling under the weight of it all? The room around him felt too small, too quiet, and the silence only seemed to amplify the roar of his thoughts. Izuku sat down on the edge of his bed, resting his elbows on his knees, burying his face in his hands. For so long, he had been fighting to become stronger, fighting to live up to the expectations placed on him, fighting to prove that he was worthy of One for All. But now, it felt like the fight was turning inward, like he was battling against himself. And no matter how hard he pushed, how much he tried to ignore the feeling, it was getting harder to stay afloat. A knock on his door pulled him from his spiraling thoughts. It was light, hesitant, like whoever was on the other side wasn't sure if they should be there. Izuku straightened up, quickly wiping his face even though he hadn't been crying. It was just a habit, pretending everything was fine. Midoriya? It was Uraraka's voice, soft and concerned. Are you in there? Izuku's heart skipped a beat. He hesitated for a moment before standing up and crossing the room to open the door. Uraraka stood there, her brown eyes filled with concern. Hey, she said with a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. You didn't come down for dinner. I just wanted to check on you. Oh, Izuku forced a smile, the familiar mask slipping into place. I guess I lost track of time. I'm fine, really. Uraraka tilted her head slightly, studying him. Are you sure? You've been off lately. We're all worried about you. Izuku's heart sank. They noticed? He thought he'd been doing a good job hiding it. The last thing he wanted was for his friends to worry about him. They had enough to deal with on their own. They didn't need to carry his burdens, too. I'm fine, he repeated, the lie coming out more easily than he would have liked. Just, a lot on my mind, I guess. Uraraka didn't look convinced, but she didn't push. Okay. But if you ever need to talk, we're here for you, you know that, right? Yeah, Izuku said, nodding. Thanks, Uraraka. She smiled again, but it was still tinged with worry. Alright, well, try to get some rest, okay? I will, Izuku said, even though he knew sleep was the last thing that would come tonight. As she turned to leave, Izuku closed the door behind her, the silence rushing back in like a wave. He leaned against the door for a moment, his mind racing. He wanted to believe her, that his friends were there for him, that he didn't have to do this alone. But every time he thought about leaning on them, the fear crept in. What if they see how weak I really am? He couldn't afford that. Not now, not when there was so much at stake. Izuku returned to his bed, sitting down again and staring at his hands. They were trembling. He clenched them into fists, trying to steady himself, but the shaking wouldn't stop. Drowning, the word echoed in his mind, louder now. He felt like he was drowning, but he couldn't let anyone know. Not yet. Not when he didn't even know how to pull himself out. For now, all he could do was keep treading water, pretending everything was fine, hoping that someday, somehow, he would learn how to breathe again. The air in Gym Gamma was thick with the heat of intense training. Shouts of determination and the crackle of quirks echoed off the high ceilings, as the students of Class 1 had pushed themselves to their limits. Izuku stood at the center of the training ground, his fists clenched and his breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts. His body was sore, his muscles screaming in protest, but he kept pushing forward. Just a little more. I can handle this. I have to. He launched forward, one for all crackling along his limbs as he dodged another incoming attack from Todoroki. The half-cold, half-hot hero had upped the intensity of his attacks, and ice jutted up from the ground, blocking Izuku's path. But Izuku wasn't fazed. He smashed through the ice with a sharp punch, his mind focused only on pushing harder, faster. There was a brief moment of satisfaction as the ice shattered under his strength, but it was quickly replaced by the familiar weight in his chest. His body was moving, his quirk was working, but his mind, his heart, felt heavy. He could feel his stamina slipping, his control wavering. The pressure inside him, the need to keep going, was becoming unbearable. Izuku, stop. A voice rang out over the din, but Izuku barely registered it. He was already spinning toward the next obstacle, forcing one for all into his legs, for a quick burst of speed. His vision blurred for a moment, but he blinked it away, refusing to slow down. He couldn't stop. He had to keep going. His body, however, had other ideas. As he landed the next punch, a sharp pain shot through his arm. It wasn't the usual discomfort from pushing himself too hard. This was something deeper, sharper. His whole body stiffened, his knees buckling under him as the world tilted sideways. He felt himself hit the ground, but everything was a haze. Izuku. That voice again, closer now, filled with worry. Before he could fully comprehend what was happening, strong hands were pulling him up, helping him sit upright. Blinking against the disorientation, Izuku found himself face to face with Ida, his normally composed classmate looking uncharacteristically panicked. You're pushing yourself too hard again, Ida said, his voice tight with concern. You need to stop before you seriously injure yourself. Izuku shook his head, though the motion made him dizzy. I'm fine, he mumbled, even though he wasn't. He could feel his body trembling, his muscles on the verge of giving out completely. But the words came automatically, as they always did. I'm fine. Everything's fine. You don't look fine, Todoroki's voice chimed in from behind, his arms crossed over his chest as he eyed Izuku with a frown. You're not fighting us, you're fighting yourself. Izuku's heart sank at that. Were they starting to see through him? Through the cracks in the armor he had worked so hard to keep in place? I just need more training, Izuku said, forcing himself to stand even though every part of him was screaming to stop. I need to get stronger. I can't slow down now. Uraraka joined the group, her eyes wide with concern. Izuku, you've been going non-stop. We're all worried about you. Izuku's chest tightened. Worried about me? That was the last thing he wanted. If they were worried, it meant they saw him as fragile, as weak. He couldn't be weak. Not in front of them. Not with everything at stake. I can handle it, he insisted, his voice sharper than he intended. He didn't mean to sound defensive, but he couldn't help it. The frustration was building inside him, swirling with the fear that was always just beneath the surface. The fear that if he stopped, if he let up for even a moment, everything would come crashing down. The others exchanged glances, and Izuku could feel their eyes on him, judging, analyzing, seeing more than he wanted them to. Midoriya, this isn't just about getting stronger, Ida said, his voice gentle but firm. You're going to break if you keep this up. Ida's right, Uraraka added softly. You've been acting different lately. We just want to help. Help. The word stung, cutting deeper than it should have. They wanted to help, but they couldn't. Not really. How could they help when they didn't understand the pressure he was under? The weight of one for all, the expectations of becoming the next symbol of peace, the constant need to prove himself worthy of the power he'd been given, it wasn't something they could take on. It was his burden to carry. His alone. I'm fine, Izuku said again, forcing the words out through gritted teeth. I don't need help. The silence that followed was heavy, uncomfortable. He knew they didn't believe him. He could see it in their eyes, the doubt, the worry. But he couldn't afford to let them in. Not now. Not when he was barely holding it together himself. Todoroki stepped forward, his expression unreadable. It's not weak to ask for help, you know. Izuku's jaw tightened. He wanted to scream. To tell them they were wrong. That he wasn't weak. That he didn't need anyone. But the words stuck in his throat, choking him. Instead, he nodded, giving them the answer they wanted to hear. I know. Todoroki studied him for a moment longer, before stepping back. The tension in the air eased slightly, but the concern didn't leave their eyes. Ida placed a hand on Izuku's shoulder, giving him a small, reassuring squeeze. Just, take care of yourself, alright? Izuku forced a smile. Yeah. I will. They didn't look convinced, but they didn't press him further. One by one, they turned and headed back to the training area, leaving Izuku standing alone in the middle of the gym. He watched them go, his chest tightening with guilt. He hated lying to them. He hated pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. But what choice did he have? As soon as they were out of sight, Izuku let the fake smile drop. He sank to his knees, the exhaustion finally catching up with him. His body ached, his mind was a mess, and his heart felt like it was being crushed under the weight of everything he couldn't say. He sat there for a long time, staring at the ground, trying to catch his breath. Trying to convince himself that he wasn't falling apart. But the cracks in his armor were widening, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold himself together. The office was quiet, the ticking of the wall clock the only sound breaking the stillness. Izuku sat stiffly in the chair opposite Aizawa's desk, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his fingers fidgeting without his control. He hated how small he felt sitting there, like a child about to be reprimanded by a parent. But there was something worse gnawing at him, the feeling that Aizawa could see through him, that his teacher could read all the things Izuku was desperately trying to hide. Aizawa sat behind his desk, his eyes half-lidded, his usual tired expression masking whatever thoughts were running through his mind. He hadn't said anything since Izuku had entered the room. The silence was suffocating, and Izuku's heart pounded louder with each passing second. Finally, Aizawa spoke. "You're pushing yourself too hard again." Izuku flinched. There was no judgment in Aizawa's voice, just a calm statement of fact. But it hit Izuku like a blow nonetheless. I'm just trying to improve," Izuku said quickly, his voice coming out more defensive than he intended. "There's a lot I need to work on. If I don't keep training, I'll fall behind, and—" "You're not falling behind," Aizawa interrupted, his gaze sharpening. "You're burning yourself out." Izuku's throat tightened. He wanted to argue, to say that he had to keep going, that he couldn't slow down. But the words wouldn't come. Aizawa's gaze was too piercing, too knowing, and Izuku felt his resolve falter. "I know what you're doing, Midoriya," Aizawa said, leaning back in his chair. "You think that if you don't push yourself to the breaking point, you're failing. You think that if you don't keep moving, you'll lose control of everything." Izuku's heart skipped a beat. How did Aizawa know? How could he possibly understand what Izuku was feeling? The constant pressure, the weight of one for all, the fear that if he let his guard down, even for a moment, everything would come crashing down around him. "I'm not," Izuku started, but his voice faltered. Aizawa didn't wait for him to finish. "You remind me of someone." Izuku blinked, taken aback by the sudden shift in the conversation. "A long time ago, I had a student with the same mindset," Aizawa continued, his voice calm but laced with something deeper, something that sounded almost like regret. "He thought he had to shoulder everything on his own. Thought asking for help was a sign of weakness." Izuku swallowed hard, his hands tightening into fists in his lap. He pushed himself too hard, too fast. Eventually, he burned out. And when he finally realized he couldn't do it all on his own, it was too late. Izuku's chest ached at the weight of Aizawa's words. He couldn't help but wonder, was Aizawa talking about someone from his past, or was this a warning about Izuku's future? "I'm not saying you're there yet," Aizawa said, his voice softer now, "but if you keep going the way you are, you will be." Izuku looked down, his heart pounding in his ears. He could feel the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. He didn't want to be like that student Aizawa had mentioned. He didn't want to burn out. But how could he stop? How could he slow down when there was so much at stake? "I don't have a choice," Izuku said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's so much riding on this. On me. If I fail, if I'm not strong enough, I'll let everyone down." Aizawa was silent for a moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was firm but gentle. "You're not the only one fighting." Izuku's head shot up, his eyes wide with confusion. "What do you mean?" Aizawa leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "You have friends, Midoriya. You have a whole class full of people who would fight beside you, who would carry the weight with you if you let them. But you're not letting them." Izuku's stomach twisted. He wanted to believe Aizawa's words, but there was a part of him, an insistent, nagging voice in the back of his mind, that told him it wasn't that simple. His classmates were strong, yes, but they didn't have one for all. They didn't understand the burden that came with being All Might's successor. "They don't," Izuku started, but Aizawa cut him off again. "They don't have your quirk," Aizawa finished for him. "But they have something just as valuable. They have you, and right now, you're not giving them a chance to help, because you're too afraid to let go of that control." Izuku's mouth went dry. He hadn't thought of it like that before. It wasn't that he didn't trust his friends, it was that he didn't trust himself to let go. The fear of losing control, of failing, was so overwhelming that it felt easier to keep everything locked inside, to shoulder the burden alone. Izuku's voice cracked, and he looked down at his lap again, unable to meet Aizawa's gaze. I don't know how. Aizawa was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before. It's not easy. I get that. But you don't have to figure it out all at once. Start small. Let someone in, even if it's just a little. You'd be surprised how much that can help. Izuku's chest felt tight, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. He wanted to believe Aizawa, wanted to believe that asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness. But the fear of being seen as anything less than capable, less than worthy, it was still there, clawing at him. Aizawa must have sensed his hesitation, because he sighed and leaned back in his chair again, folding his arms across his chest. You don't have to do it all at once, he repeated. But you can't keep going like this, Midoriya. You'll break, and when you do, it's not just you who'll suffer. The people who care about you will, too. Izuku flinched at that. He thought about his classmates, Uraraka, Ida, Todoroki, all the people who had tried to reach out to him in their own ways. He thought about All Might, who had placed so much faith in him, and about how devastated he would be if Izuku burned out and couldn't carry on the legacy of One for All. And then he thought about the weight he was carrying. The crushing, suffocating feeling that had been pressing down on him for so long that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. Maybe Aizawa was right. Maybe he couldn't keep going like this. I'll try, Izuku said, his voice quiet but sincere. I'll try to let someone in. Aizawa gave a small nod, his eyes softening just a bit. That's all I'm asking. For the first time in what felt like forever, Izuku allowed himself to breathe a little easier. It wasn't a solution, and it didn't erase the weight on his shoulders, but it was a start. A small step in the right direction. I know you're strong, Midoriya, Aizawa added, his voice steady and reassuring. But strength isn't just about how much you can handle on your own. Sometimes, it's about knowing when to lean on others. Izuku nodded, the words sinking in. He didn't know how long it would take for him to truly let go of the fear, but he knew that Aizawa was right. If he kept going the way he had been, he'd break. And maybe, just maybe, it was okay to not have all the answers right now. As he left Aizawa's office, the weight in his chest felt a little lighter. The fear was still there, lurking in the back of his mind, but for the first time, Izuku allowed himself to hope that he didn't have to drown alone. The common room of the dorms was unusually quiet, lit only by the soft glow of the moon filtering in through the large windows. It was late, later than most of the students usually stayed up. Izuku sat on one of the couches, legs tucked under him as he stared blankly at the notebook in his hands. The words he'd scribbled earlier in the day swam before his eyes, but his mind wasn't absorbing any of it. He should have been asleep hours ago. His body ached from the relentless training, and exhaustion clung to him like a heavy cloak. But no matter how much he tried, he couldn't shut off his mind. He couldn't escape the thoughts, the pressure, the ever-present weight on his shoulders. It was always there, like an undercurrent pulling him down, keeping him from the surface. The familiar feeling of drowning. Izuku sighed and closed the notebook, letting it rest on his lap as he leaned back against the couch. His eyes were heavy, but sleep felt impossible. His thoughts were a whirlpool of unfinished tasks, responsibilities, and expectations. He was so lost in them that he almost didn't hear the soft footsteps approaching. Can't sleep either? Izuku blinked, turning toward the voice. Hitoshi Shinso stood in the doorway, his usual tired expression softened by the dim light. He wore a loose hoodie, his hair even more unruly than usual, and his hands were tucked into his pockets as he walked further into the room. Izuku hadn't expected to see Shinso here, but then again, it wasn't all that surprising. He had heard from others that Shinso struggled with insomnia. They'd never talked about it, but there was an unspoken understanding that late nights were a common occurrence for both of them. Yeah, Izuku mumbled, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I guess I've got a lot on my mind. Shinso raised an eyebrow as he sank down onto the couch opposite Izuku, stretching his legs out in front of him. You? With too much on your mind? I never would have guessed. There was a dry hint of sarcasm in his voice, but it wasn't harsh. If anything, it was almost understanding. Izuku chuckled weakly. Yeah, I guess I'm kind of known for overthinking. Shinso didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned his head back against the cushion, staring up at the ceiling as if the patterns in the plaster held answers to unspoken questions. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, though. It was the kind of quiet that felt safe, where neither of them had to fill the space with forced words. For a while, neither spoke, and the stillness of the room wrapped around them like a blanket. Izuku found himself relaxing slightly, the tightness in his chest easing just a little. He hadn't realized how tense he'd been until now, sitting here with someone who wasn't expecting anything from him. Shinso finally broke the silence. You've been looking pretty beat lately. Izuku glanced over at him, surprised. He wasn't sure if Shinso had meant to sound concerned, but there was a blunt honesty to his words that made Izuku feel seen. Like Shinso could tell something was off without prying too deeply. Yeah, Izuku admitted quietly, rubbing the back of his neck. I've just been trying to keep up with everything. Training, schoolwork, one for all. It's a lot. Shinso's eyes flicked toward him, but he didn't say anything at first. Instead, he just nodded, as if to acknowledge the weight of Izuku's words, without forcing him to elaborate. I get that, Shinso said after a moment, his voice soft, but not pitying. Everyone's got their own crap to deal with. It sucks. Izuku blinked, surprised by the simplicity of Shinso's response. No sugarcoating, no empty reassurances. Just an honest acknowledgement that life was hard, and sometimes there wasn't much more to say about it. Yeah, it really does, Izuku replied, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Shinso leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees as he stared at the floor. The thing is, you're not the only one dealing with it. Even if it feels like you are. Izuku looked down at his hands, the weight of Shinso's words settling over him. He'd heard similar things before, Aizawa, Uraraka, and the others had all tried to tell him that he didn't have to do everything alone. But hearing it from Shinso, someone who wasn't close to him the way his other friends were, felt different. It felt less like advice, and more like a quiet understanding. Shinso knew what it was like to carry a burden. He'd faced his own struggles, trying to prove himself, despite the stigma surrounding his quirk. He understood what it was like to feel like you had to fight alone, even if you didn't want to. Izuku found himself speaking before he could stop himself. Do you ever feel like you're drowning? Shinso didn't respond right away, and for a moment, Izuku thought maybe he'd overstepped. But then Shinso nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the floor. Yeah, he said quietly. A lot, actually. Izuku's chest tightened, but this time it wasn't from anxiety. It was something else, something like relief. He wasn't alone. Someone else understood. Someone else knew what it felt like to be overwhelmed, to feel like you were sinking beneath the weight of everything you couldn't control. Shinso finally lifted his head, his violet eyes meeting Izuku's. But you don't have to drown. Izuku blinked, caught off guard by the quiet intensity in Shinso's voice. Shinso leaned back again, his expression calm but serious. I'm not saying it's easy. Hell, it's probably one of the hardest things you'll ever do. But, you can ask for help. And it doesn't make you weak. It just means you're smart enough to know when you need a hand. Izuku swallowed hard, the familiar knot tightening in his throat. He wanted to believe Shinso. He wanted to believe that asking for help didn't make him weak. But the fear of being seen as fragile, of failing, it was still there, gnawing at him. I don't know how, Izuku admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Shinso didn't react with surprise or judgment. Instead, he just shrugged, his lips quirking into a small, almost rueful smile. Neither do I, most of the time. But I'm learning. Izuku's eyes widened slightly. You are? Shinso nodded. Yeah. It's not something that happens overnight. But, having people around who get it, even just a little, helps. Izuku stared at him, the weight of Shinso's words sinking in. It wasn't a grand revelation or some magical solution. It was just truth. A small, quiet truth that maybe, just maybe, could make a difference. For the first time in what felt like forever, Izuku felt the tiniest bit of hope stir within him. Maybe he didn't have to have all the answers right now. Maybe it was okay to take things one step at a time. Maybe, just maybe, he could learn to ask for help, slowly, in his own way. Thanks, Shinso, Izuku said softly, the words genuine. Shinso shrugged again, though there was a small, understanding smile on his face. Don't mention it. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't heavy or uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that felt safe, where neither of them had to pretend or put on a brave face. They didn't need to talk about everything all at once. They didn't need to push for answers. For now, sitting here together in the quiet of the night was enough. As Izuku leaned back against the couch, the weight in his chest felt just a little lighter. The drowning feeling wasn't gone, but for the first time, it didn't feel like he was sinking alone. The midday sun filtered through the windows of Gym Gamma, casting soft golden light over the training grounds. The faint sounds of other students sparring and practicing echoed in the distance, but Izuku's focus was squarely on the ice walls in front of him. Todoroki stood across from him, his expression calm as always, his arms crossed over his chest. His half-cold, half-hot quirk had already created an intricate maze of frozen obstacles, a challenge designed to test Izuku's agility and problem-solving skills. But today, Izuku's thoughts weren't just on the training. They were on the conversation he'd had with Shinso the night before. The quiet understanding, the shared struggles, it had left a mark on him, one that he hadn't been able to shake. He had promised himself that he would try, even if it was just a small step, to let someone in. To stop fighting everything on his own. But now, standing in front of the icy labyrinth, his chest tight with nervous energy, he wasn't sure if he could follow through. Asterisk just start small. Let someone in, even if it's a little asterisk. Aizawa's words echoed in his mind, and for a brief moment, Izuku considered turning back. His instincts told him to press forward alone, to face the challenge on his own as he always had. But then he looked at Todoroki, his classmate, his friend, and the hesitation flickered in his heart. This was the time to try. All right, Midoriya, Todoroki said, his voice calm but firm. Let's start. Izuku nodded, taking a deep breath as he prepared to charge forward. His body buzzed with the familiar energy of one for all crackling beneath the surface, but his heart was pounding for a different reason. He was about to make a choice that felt foreign to him, something that scared him more than the training itself. As Izuku sprinted forward, the first ice wall loomed ahead. He leapt to the side, avoiding the frozen barrier by a hair, but his movements were tense. His focus was fractured, and though he tried to move with precision, his mind kept drifting back to the weight on his shoulders. The familiar thought, I have to do this on my own. He kept moving, but he wasn't fast enough. Another ice wall erupted from the ground, blocking his path. He hesitated for a split second, and in that moment of indecision, the ice caught him. The chill wrapped around his legs, freezing him in place. Todoroki was already walking toward him, his expression unreadable. Izuku's face flushed with frustration. He hated feeling like this, like he was failing, like he wasn't strong enough. "You're hesitating," Todoroki said simply as he approached, his hands glowing faintly with heat as he melted the ice around Izuku's legs. "What's going on with you?" Izuku's heart thudded in his chest. This was the moment. The small step. He could feel the words rising in his throat, but they stuck there, like they always did. Asking for help had always felt like admitting weakness, like confessing that he wasn't enough. But then he remembered Shinso's words from the night before. It doesn't make you weak. It just means you're smart enough to know when you need a hand. Izuku swallowed hard, his hands balling into fists at his sides. He didn't have to let everything spill out. He didn't have to tell Todoroki everything all at once. He just had to start small. Izuku hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been struggling." Todoroki raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the admission. Izuku never talked about his feelings during training. He never let anyone see that side of him, the side that was worn down, the side that felt like he was drowning under the weight of everything. "Struggling how?" Todoroki asked, his tone neutral, but with a hint of concern. Izuku looked down at his feet, the words still sticking in his throat. Just a little, he had promised himself he would try, so he forced himself to speak again. "It's been hard to keep up with everything," Izuku said quietly, his voice shaking slightly. "Training, school, one for all. I feel like I'm always behind, like I have to keep pushing or I'll fail." There. He had said it. It wasn't everything, but it was enough for now. He glanced up at Todoroki, bracing himself for the judgment he was sure would come. But Todoroki's expression remained calm, his mismatched eyes watching Izuku with quiet intensity. "That's understandable," Todoroki said, after a long pause. "You've been dealing with more than anyone else in our class. You're allowed to feel that way." Izuku blinked, caught off guard by the response. He had expected something more distant. Maybe even dismissive. But Todoroki's words weren't full of pity or condescension. They were simple. Honest. "Thanks," Izuku mumbled, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over him. Todoroki gave a small nod. "You don't have to handle everything by yourself, you know." There it was again, that same message that Izuku had heard from Shinso, from Aizawa, from so many others. He had always brushed it off, believing that his burden was his alone. But now, standing in front of Todoroki, who had his own struggles, his own pain, Izuku realized that maybe there was some truth to it. Maybe he didn't have to do everything alone. "I know," Izuku said, the words feeling more real now, more genuine. "I'm trying." Todoroki's eyes softened just slightly, and for a moment, the cold and aloof barrier that usually surrounded him seemed to melt away. He gestured toward the ice walls still standing behind them. "Let's work together this time," Todoroki suggested, his voice calm but firm. "We'll break through it together." Izuku's heart skipped a beat. It was such a simple offer, but it felt monumental to him. Working together. Not just relying on his own strength, but trusting someone else's. For a long moment, Izuku hesitated. His instincts screamed at him to refuse, to prove that he could handle it on his own. But that was the old way. The way that had been wearing him down, making him feel like he was drowning. He took a deep breath, the tension in his chest easing slightly as he gave a small nod. "Okay. Let's do it." Todoroki's lips quirked into a faint smile, and with a flick of his wrist, he summoned a wave of fire to melt the ice walls in their path. Izuku summoned one for all to his limbs, feeling the power hum beneath his skin. But this time as he moved forward, it wasn't just his strength that propelled him. It was Todoroki's as well. They worked in tandem, a seamless flow of movement and power. Todoroki's ice created paths for Izuku to navigate, and when the obstacles became too difficult, Todoroki's fire melted them away. Izuku didn't have to carry the entire burden. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was drowning. By the time they reached the end of the course, Izuku's heart was pounding, but not from exhaustion. It was a different kind of feeling, one that felt lighter, like he could finally breathe. He turned to Todoroki, a small but genuine smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks, Todoroki." Todoroki gave a quiet nod. "Anytime, Midoriya." As they walked back toward the entrance of the gym, Izuku felt the weight on his shoulders ease just a little more. The fear wasn't gone, and the burden of one for all still lingered in the back of his mind. But now, there was something else, a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry it alone. And that was enough. The city streets were quiet, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. It was late, and most of the civilians had already retreated to their homes, unaware of the tension bubbling just beneath the surface. But for the students of UA, the night was far from over. Izuku moved swiftly, his breath heavy in his chest as he sprinted down the alleyway. His body was pushed to the limit, muscles straining, lungs burning, but he couldn't stop now. Not when the danger was so close. Ahead, he could hear the sound of explosions. Bakugo was fighting somewhere nearby, his aggressive blasts rattling the air. Todoroki and Ida were in the fray as well, battling the mysterious new villain that had appeared out of nowhere. The others were spread across the city, keeping the civilians safe and holding the line. But no matter how hard they fought, the villain seemed one step ahead. The villain's power was unlike anything Izuku had faced before. It wasn't physical strength or raw destruction, it was something far more insidious. The villain, known as Shade, could manipulate shadows, using them to paralyze his enemies or hide in plain sight. Every time they thought they had him cornered, he disappeared, slipping into the darkness and reappearing somewhere else, launching another attack from an unseen angle. Izuku clenched his fists as he rounded the corner, his mind racing. He had to find a way to stop Shade. His friends were counting on him. The civilians were counting on him. If he couldn't figure this out, people would get hurt. And yet, the more he tried to come up with a solution, the more the familiar pressure started to crush him. I have to do this. I have to stop him. The weight of it all threatened to pull him under again, the same suffocating feeling that had haunted him for weeks. He could feel it, he was sinking, drowning in the responsibility. But now wasn't the time to falter. He couldn't afford to fail. Just as the thoughts threatened to overwhelm him, a sharp cry broke through the air. Izuku! Izuku skidded to a halt, his heart pounding as he whipped around to see Shinso, his face set in a grim expression. He must have joined the battle when things got worse. His capture weapon was wrapped around his shoulders, ready for use, and his eyes scanned the area with quiet intensity. "We've got a problem," Shinso said as he reached Izuku, his voice low but urgent. "Shade's moving too fast. Every time we think we've trapped him, he slips away again. We're going to need to work together to pin him down." Izuku's chest tightened. Work together, his instinct screamed at him to push forward, to take control, to find a way to stop the villain on his own. But the logical part of his mind, the part that had been learning, slowly but surely, that he didn't have to do this alone, knew that wasn't the right answer. Shinso was watching him, waiting for his response. He could see the tension in Izuku's stance, the battle raging behind his eyes. But he didn't push. He just waited, trusting that Izuku would come to the right decision. Izuku swallowed hard, forcing himself to take a breath. This was it, another moment where he could choose. He could try to handle it all alone, or he could trust in his friends, trust in Shinso, and share the burden. Forcing down the panic, Izuku nodded. "Okay. Let's work together." Shinso's eyes softened slightly, and without another word, he turned toward the shadowy alley where they had last seen Shade. Izuku followed, his heart still racing, but now it wasn't from fear. It was from something else, something like hope. As they approached the alley, they saw Todoroki, his ice walls shimmering under the dim light, blocking Shade's path. Ida was moving in from the other side, his engines roaring as he attempted to corner the villain. But Shade was already slipping through the cracks, his form dissolving into the shadows, making it impossible to land a direct hit. Izuku gritted his teeth. This was exactly what had been happening all night. They needed to find a way to stop Shade from disappearing, or they'd never be able to pin him down. Shinso, Izuku said, his mind racing as an idea began to form. Can you catch him off guard with your quirk? If we can get him to speak, you can stop him from moving. Shinso nodded, his eyes narrowing in focus. Yeah, but we need to distract him long enough to get him to talk. He's smart, he's not going to let himself get caught easily. I can do that, Izuku said, feeling the familiar hum of one for all in his veins. I'll keep him busy, and you get ready. Once he's distracted, we'll have our chance. Shinso didn't hesitate. Let's do it. As they approached, Izuku launched himself forward, his body crackling with energy as he sent a powerful punch toward Shade. The villain dodged, slipping into the shadows again, but Izuku was ready. He spun midair, smashing through the ice and sending debris scattering in all directions. He wasn't aiming to hit Shade, he was just trying to keep him moving, to make him think he was being reckless. Shade reappeared a few feet away, his eyes gleaming with a cruel smile. You really think you can stop me, boy? You're just a kid. Izuku's heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm. He kept moving, leaping from shadow to shadow, keeping Shade's attention locked on him. Every movement, every punch, was carefully planned, designed to keep the villain distracted, to force him to focus on Izuku instead of his escape. And then, out of the corner of his eye, Izuku saw it, the slight flicker in Shade's expression as he prepared to slip away again. Now. Izuku lunged forward, his fist glowing with the power of one for all. He wasn't aiming to hit, just to draw Shade's attention for one crucial moment. Why do you keep running? Izuku shouted, his voice ringing out through the alley. Are you that scared of us? Shade's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sneer. Scared? Of you? Don't make me laugh. The moment the words left his mouth, Shinso's quirk activated. The air around them seemed to still, and Shade's movements froze in place. Izuku landed, panting slightly as he straightened up. It had worked. Shinso stepped forward, his capture weapon uncoiling as he approached the now immobilized villain. Got him. The relief that flooded Izuku's chest was overwhelming. For the first time that night, it felt like they had a real chance. Not just because they had stopped the villain, but because Izuku hadn't done it alone. He had trusted his friends, worked with them, and together they had made it happen. Todoroki and Ida joined them, both looking equally relieved as they helped secure the area. The battle wasn't over, there would still be cleanup, and Shade wasn't their only threat, but for now, they had won. Together. As they gathered in the alley, Shinso gave Izuku a small nod. It was a quiet acknowledgement, a shared understanding that spoke volumes. No words were needed. They had done this together, and that was enough. Izuku's heart was still racing, but it wasn't from fear anymore. The weight on his shoulders was still there, but it was lighter now, shared between his friends. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Izuku didn't feel like he was drowning. He was still in deep water, but now, he was learning to swim. The aftermath of the battle was a blur. The adrenaline that had carried Izuku through the fight was fading, leaving him drained, both physically and emotionally. He leaned against the wall of the alley, the cool brick pressing into his back as he watched the police officers secure the villain. Shade had been captured, immobilized by Shinso's quirk, and now the authorities were taking him away. It was over. Izuku let out a shaky breath, his body finally relaxing. His muscles ached, his limbs felt heavy, but for the first time in weeks, his mind was quiet. The constant pressure, the overwhelming sense of responsibility that had been suffocating him, was still there, but it wasn't crushing him anymore. It wasn't drowning him. I didn't do it alone. The realization settled over him like a warm blanket. He had relied on his friends, on Shinso, Todoroki, Ida, and together, they had won. It hadn't been easy. There were still moments where he had hesitated, where the old fear of failure had crept in. But in those moments, he had chosen to trust them, to let them carry part of the weight. And because of that, they had succeeded. Todoroki approached him, his face calm, but his mismatched eyes filled with quiet concern. You okay, Midoriya? Izuku nodded, though he felt a twinge of guilt at the concern in Todoroki's voice. His friends had been worrying about him for weeks, and he had tried to push them away, thinking he had to carry everything on his own. But now, standing here with Todoroki, the weight of that guilt began to lift. I'm fine, Izuku said, his voice soft but sincere. Thanks, Todoroki. For helping me earlier. I couldn't have done it without you. Todoroki gave a small nod, his expression as calm as ever. We're a team. You don't have to do everything alone. There it was again, the same message that had been repeated to Izuku over and over. From Aizawa, from Shinso, and now from Todoroki. But this time, the words didn't feel like a lesson he was trying to learn. They felt like the truth. A truth he was finally starting to accept. I know, Izuku said quietly. I'm trying. Todoroki gave him a rare, faint smile, before turning toward the rest of the team, who were gathered at the end of the alley. Ida was already talking to the police, explaining the details of the fight, while Shinso stood off to the side, his capture weapon still draped over his shoulders. Uraraka and Kurashima, who had arrived toward the end of the battle, were checking on the civilians, making sure everyone was safe. Izuku watched them, a strange mix of exhaustion and gratitude filling his chest. He had always been surrounded by incredible people, strong, brave, and kind. But for so long, he had distanced himself from them, believing that he had to shoulder everything on his own. Now, he could see how wrong he had been. They're not just here to fight beside me. They're here to help me carry the weight, He took a deep breath, feeling the tightness in his chest ease just a little more. The drowning feeling that had been with him for so long was still there, but it was no longer pulling him under. He was learning to swim, learning to breathe again. As the police wrapped up their work, the group gathered together, ready to return to Ida, ever the responsible leader, took charge of organizing the return trip, making sure everyone was accounted for. But as they started to leave, Shinso hung back, his gaze flicking toward Izuku. Hey, Shinso said, his voice low as he stepped closer. You did good out there. Izuku blinked, surprised by the compliment. Shinso wasn't the type to hand out praise easily, which made the words all the more meaningful. Izuku felt a small smile tug at his lips. You too, Izuku replied. I couldn't have done it without you. Shinso shrugged, his usual nonchalant expression returning, but there was something softer in his eyes. Like I said before, you don't have to drown. You just have to let people in. Izuku's heart clenched at the words. He hadn't forgotten their conversation from the night before, the quiet understanding they had shared. And now, after everything that had happened, those words held even more weight. He wasn't drowning anymore. Or at least, not in the same way he had been before. Yeah, Izuku said softly. I'm starting to understand that. Shinso gave him a small nod, the unspoken understanding passing between them once again. It wasn't something that needed to be said aloud, it was just there, between them. The knowledge that they had both been struggling, both trying to carry more than they should, and both learning, slowly, that they didn't have to do it alone. As they began the walk back to UA, the silence between them was comfortable. The tension that had once gripped Izuku's chest was easing, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. He wasn't completely free of the weight, but he was no longer suffocating under it. They reached the dorms, the warm lights glowing in the windows as the rest of Class 1A welcomed them back. There were cheers, pats on the back, and smiles of relief as their classmates crowded around, asking for details about the battle. Izuku felt the warmth of their support, the way they all came together to celebrate the victory. He wasn't standing on the outside looking in anymore. He was part of this, part of a team, part of something bigger than himself. As the excitement settled, and the students began to disperse, Izuku found himself alone in the common area, the quiet returning once more. He sank into one of the couches, letting out a long, tired sigh. His body ached, and his mind was still reeling from the events of the night, but he felt lighter. The weight on his shoulders was still there, but it wasn't crushing him anymore. He had learned to let go, even just a little. He had learned to trust his friends, to let them help carry the burden. And that was enough for now. Izuku leaned his head back against the couch, closing his eyes for a moment. The quiet settled around him, but this time it wasn't suffocating. It was peaceful. He was exhausted, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't afraid to rest. As he sat there, the soft sounds of his classmates chatting in the distance, Izuku allowed himself a moment to breathe. He didn't have all the answers yet, and the road ahead would still be hard, but now he knew that he didn't have to walk it alone. He wasn't drowning anymore. And that made all the difference. The sky was painted in soft shades of pink and gold as the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows over the UA campus. Izuku stood on the rooftop of the dorms, his hands resting on the cool metal railing as he gazed out at the horizon. The city sprawled out before him, quiet and peaceful in the fading light, a stark contrast to the chaos of the battle from the previous night. It had been a long day. After the fight with Shade, the school administration had conducted their usual debriefings and follow-ups, making sure everyone was safe and accounted for. The students were tired, their bodies aching from the battle, but the atmosphere in the dorms had been one of quiet celebration. They had won. Together. Izuku had felt it all, the exhaustion, the relief, and most of all, the warmth of his friends' support. It had been overwhelming at times, but in a good way. For so long, he had carried the weight of his responsibilities alone, but now, as he stood on the rooftop, the familiar pressure in his chest had eased. He wasn't drowning anymore. He was learning to breathe again. A soft knock on the door leading to the roof pulled Izuku from his thoughts. He turned to see Shinso stepping out, his expression unreadable as always, but there was a quiet familiarity in his presence. "Figured I'd find you up here," Shinso said, walking over to join him at the railing. "You've been disappearing a lot lately." Izuku smiled, though it was more tired than anything. "Yeah. I like the quiet." Shinso nodded, leaning against the railing beside him. They stood in silence for a moment, the wind ruffling their hair, the sound of distant traffic carrying up from the city below. "You've changed," Shinso said after a while, his voice soft but direct. "Since the fight last night. Something's different." Izuku didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure how to put it into words, but Shinso was right. Something had changed. It wasn't something obvious, and it wasn't something that had happened all at once. It had been gradual, like the slow rise of the sun after a long night. "I think," Izuku started, his voice quiet, "I think I'm finally starting to understand that I don't have to do everything alone." Shinso glanced at him, his violet eyes sharp but not unkind. "Took you long enough?" Izuku laughed softly, the sound carrying in the wind. "Yeah, I guess it did." It had taken him a long time, longer than he would have liked to admit. But now, standing here with Shinso, he could see how far he had come. The drowning feeling that had once consumed him was still there, but it wasn't as strong. It no longer controlled him. He was learning, slowly but surely, to trust the people around him. to let them in. I was so scared of letting anyone see how much I was struggling, Izuku said, his eyes fixed on the horizon. I thought it would make me look weak, or that I'd let everyone down if I couldn't handle everything by myself. Shinso didn't say anything, but Izuku knew he understood. Shinso had his own battles, his own fears of not being enough, of not living up to the expectations of others. They weren't the same struggles, but they were similar enough. But last night, Izuku continued, when we fought Shade, I realized I couldn't do it alone. I needed you, and Todoroki, and Ida. And I didn't fail, because I asked for help. We won because we worked together. Shinso nodded, his gaze shifting to the city below. Yeah. That's how it works. Sometimes, asking for help is the only way to win. The simplicity of the statement hit Izuku in a way that surprised him. It wasn't some grand revelation or profound insight. It was just, the truth. A truth he had been running from for far too long. I'm still learning, Izuku admitted, his voice quieter now. It's hard to let go of the idea that I have to carry everything by myself. But I'm getting there. Shinso gave a small nod, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. That's all anyone can ask for. For a long moment, they stood there in silence, watching the sun dip lower on the horizon. The quiet between them wasn't awkward or uncomfortable, it was peaceful, filled with the kind of understanding that didn't need words. Izuku felt the familiar warmth of his friend's support in his chest. It was still strange, in a way, to think that he didn't have to carry everything alone. But now, he knew that he didn't have to be afraid of letting them in. His friends weren't just his allies in battle, they were his lifelines. And he was theirs. The door to the roof creaked open again, and this time, it was Todoroki and Uraraka who stepped out, followed closely by Ida and Kurashima. They all wore the same tired but content expressions, the weight of the day finally settling in as they joined Izuku and Shinso at the railing. We were looking for you, Midoriya, Uraraka said, her smile soft as she leaned against the wall. We were going to watch a movie in the common room. Izuku glanced at her, then at the others, his heart swelling with gratitude. He wasn't sure how to express how much it meant to him that they had stuck by his side, even when he had tried to push them away. But as he looked at their faces, he realized that he didn't need to say anything. They already knew. Yeah, Izuku said, smiling. I'll be there in a minute. Uraraka nodded, and the others drifted back inside, leaving Izuku and Shinso alone on the rooftop once more. The sun had nearly set now, the sky painted in rich hues of purple and orange, and the first stars were beginning to twinkle in the growing darkness. Izuku turned to Shinso, a quiet determination settling over him. Thanks, Shinso. For everything. Shinso shrugged, his expression still nonchalant, but there was a hint of something warmer in his eyes. Don't mention it. We all need help sometimes. Izuku smiled, the words settling deep in his chest. He was still learning, still growing, but he wasn't alone anymore. He had his friends, his family, and the people who believed in him. And that made all the difference. As Shinso headed back inside, Izuku lingered on the rooftop for a moment longer, letting the cool evening air wash over him. The weight on his shoulders was still there, but it was lighter now, shared among the people he cared about. He wasn't drowning anymore. Izuku took one last deep breath before turning toward the door, ready to join his friends. This was just the beginning, a new chapter, a new beginning. And for the first time in a long time, Izuku felt like he could face whatever was coming next. Because now, he knew he didn't have to face it alone. This is the end of Rising from the Depths by the Angel Demon on AO3. I hope you liked it. If you have any suggestion, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to know when the next one is out.